Okay. Yes, yes, all good? It appears to be. Hello, good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending on where on the spinning globe you happen to be hanging out. I'm Tad. I will be here for approximately the next hour. I will be reading, and I'll explain what I'll be reading in just a moment since we just finished Through the Looking Glass during the 1 a.m., primarily for the non United States listeners or readers or audience or whatever you want to call it. Anyway, so yes, that's what's going on. Let me have a little sip because my throat is all funny. Anyway, hi, good to see you. Nice to have you with me. I am going to be reading, and as I said, I'll explain in just a moment what I'm doing. In the interim, there's, as I mentioned at some length last night, there's not a huge amount to talk about. I thought I was all done with Splintered Sun. It was one of those cases of whistling past the graveyard, as it were, because it turns out I had one more pass through the book left that I had completely forgotten about, which is the final proofs of the typeset book and blah, 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 and everything. And so I am actually going back through it again. And as I was explaining again at some length last night, there's a reason why we never pick up our own books for fun, we writers of books, especially of long books. And that is because by the time the book is published, we've been through it 5 or 6 times, and we never want to see it again in our lives. So I am currently in that stage with Splintered Sun. But I'm also, because of that, putting the other thing I was working on hold. Other than that, not a lot to say or tell. Dog's doing well. Lemon is very hard to restrain because she feels like she's well now, even though she still doesn't have her stitches out and still has a cone on. But she thinks she's okay, and she's trying to charge around whenever possible, and we are trying to restrain her and sedate her, and give her all of her meds and all that kind of stuff. And hopefully, fingers crossed, a couple of days from now at the most, she will go and get her stitches out. I don't know if the cone will stay on for a while or not, so I'm not talking to her about the cone. I don't want her to feel betrayed if I say the cone's coming off and then it has to stay on for a while. But anyway, so that's what's going on. Dogs are fine. Deb's fine. Everybody is fine. Cats running around back here. You may or may not see them depending on how excited they feel. Let me just quickly check in and see who has popped in to say hello or otherwise made themselves known. I see Emily Bell checking in from Detroit. Hello, Emily. Good to see you. Susan Shamblin. Hello, Susan. Christy. Hello, hello. Good evening. Nice to have you with us. Penny Davies. Yes, hello. Kelly Kenrick. Good evening. Ray Weatherford. Hello. Good to see you, Ray. Nice to have you with us. Medardo. Amigo mío. Es un placer de verte. And Mr. Mark Craigbaum, looking forward to Tad reflecting on his Otherland Mirror themes. Yes, you are ahead of me. That is exactly what I'm going to do. Barb Ann, hello, good to see you. Isaac, good afternoon from Tad of the mighty Tad clan. Ooh, clan of the Tad Bear. Isaac greets us from the land wreathed in craggy peaks. And Claudia checks in. Hi, good to see you, Claudia. Good to see all of you. Yes, Mark has it all right. What I'm going to do, since we just spent the last couple of weeks reading Alice Through the Looking Glass, I decided, okay, well, here's a chance to go back. I mentioned many times during the course of reading this that this book obviously was an inspiration to me dating back to my childhood, but also obviously that I used it, mined it, some might even say strip mined it for material for the Otherland books, and specifically for the first volume. I will be reading from that first volume, and depending on how much time we have tonight, I will read 1 or 2 chapters. I think I can read at least one. I keep going from one book to another book and different lengths of chapters and different fonts and, pagination and all that kind of stuff. So it's always hard to guess exactly how long, but this is a fairly substantial chunk. So I may not be able to even finish the first chapter tonight, but I think I will be able to. So that's what I'm going to do. And then depending on how much we get through tonight, I may actually read another chapter, the other chapter, because it really all takes place in 2 chapters. I may read the other chapter next week before moving on to whatever our next project will be. So that's what's going on with all of that. I'm trying to think if there's anything else of any interest, but honestly, things are pretty much like they always are, just work and staying home. And of course, being dog caretakers, which has been taking up a great deal of Deb's and my time for the last 2 weeks. Although, as you may have heard from my report at the top of the hour, Lemon is convinced that she is healthy and fit already. And every time we take her out in front to pee, that for her to pee, not us. Every time we take her out in front, she thinks we're getting into the car, which to her, is going back to doggy daycare, where all her dog buddies are, because she has never been able to get Johnny to be a reliable buddy because, well, Johnny is an old, cranky old bugger and doesn't want to be her buddy. He has gotten to the point now where he will be her cohabitant and roommate, but, he's like me, he's full of arthritic grumpiness and does not want to run around or roughhouse. But she has dogs that she roughhouses with at doggy daycare, and so she's really ready to go back. Of course, we're going to have to make sure with the vet that that's okay and when that point will be reached. But it's very, very touching every time we go out and she walks to the car and she's nosing the car door. It's like, take me to see my friends. So anyway, that's what's going on around here. Life is extremely lifelike, no complaints. And so with that, I think, I want to double check this first before I start. Okay. Let me see. Oh, got a couple of other folks have showed up. Tracy McClatchy, hello. Paul P.J. Hayden says, good evening. I'm reading from Paul's post or comment. I wanted to say Otherland is a series that took me from hating reading to absolutely adoring reading. Ooh, thank you. Thanks for the wonderful and, in my case, life-changing series. Well, that is a huge compliment, Paul, and I appreciate it very much. I cannot take personal credit for that because I didn't, obviously, come over to your house, analyze your needs, and develop a book just for you, but I'm glad it worked out that way, very much so. As I have often said, and may mention a couple more times during this broadcast or during this reading, the Otherland books are something that I'm not only proud of, obviously, but in some ways I think they're kind of my favorite of my work because they are the widest sort of expression of all the kinds of things that interest me, and they kind of flit back and forth from science fiction to pure fantasy to horror to thriller, and there's a lot of, I think, humor as well. And, there's just a lot of different kinds of things going on. They were also, they were also what I used to refer to jokingly as my kitchen sink books, because I took a lot of projects that I had begun and had never done anything with for whatever reasons. And when I was writing the Otherland books and thinking about different worlds where things could take place, I used up some of these things that I had begun but never found a way to finish or hadn't figured out what I wanted to do with them. For instance, the kind of post-apocalyptic Oz world was from a short story that I began. And it was very much like the version that wound up in Otherland. The Endless House, which is still something I'd like to do something with someday, given enough years and time. The Endless House was something that I originally conceived of as an anthology idea to try and get other writers to work on with me. Never got around to that, never wrote up a solicitation or anything like that, so nothing happened with it. And then the Otherland books came along and I went, oh, okay, well, I can use that idea at least as one of the worlds. Anyway, this everything but the kitchen sink approach became so much a theme of the books that, as I have often pointed out, I went, well, might as well put the kitchen sink in there too. And so there is a cartoon world based on those early 1930s, mid 1930s cartoons, a lot of the Fleischer cartoons and the early Disney and Warner Brothers cartoons about a kitchen coming to life at night, which actually begins in a kitchen sink. So I managed to actually get a kitchen sink into my kitchen sink book. Anyway, so with that all said, I am going to start reading. For those of you who have not read the Otherland books, there are going to be a few spoilers, and especially here at the beginning. So if you really want to still read the Otherland books and to come to them Virgo intacta, I suggest you not listen to this broadcast or put it aside until you have had a chance, because I'm going to have to explain some things. If you have read them, don't worry. These are not the most crucial surprises in the books. Those are reserved for much later volumes, and this is all from the first volume. Anyway, the most important thing to know is that the main character here is Paul Jonas. And when we first meet Paul Jonas, he appears to be stuck in a trench during the First World War on the Western Front, suffering from near endless bombardments from the German heavy guns. And he is in the trench with two of his soldier companions, two guys named Finch and Mullet. Finch, if I recall correctly, is the small, skinny one, and Mullet is the big, heavy one, and Finch wears eyeglasses. This becomes significant later on when we find out that Finch and Mullet are not really his friends at all, but in fact are more or less his jailers, and that he is not actually in the Second World War, in the First World War, but is in a simulation from which, just before this section I'm going to read, from which he escapes with the help of some mysterious benefactor that we will find out about later on. But so he is a disembodied intelligence, essentially, in a virtual universe made up of many virtual worlds. He has escaped from the one where he was being held prisoner, although we have no idea at this point why he's being held prisoner there. And he has just escaped into a new one. Although, again, he does not yet realize it. He's still dealing with the shock of having thought he was a soldier in the First World War and discovering that that premise and Finch and Mullet are highly dubious in terms of what he had thought them to be. So that's what we're reading. That's what's going on, and what the relevance of this to Alice Through the Looking Glass will pretty quickly become apparent, especially when you consider that one of the first things that happened to Alice in the Looking Glass world was passing through the nameless forest. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and start reading. Where'd you go? Come here. No, not that one. I don't want that one. Sorry, I'm dealing with a whole bunch of different input devices because of having wrist and hand problems. So, okay, where are you? I don't want you. I want you. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to skip over the net feed because it really, although it's kind of funny under the circumstances because it takes place in San Francisco, but the net feeds are the little introductory things that are essentially taken right off of the worldwide net. So anyway, I'm going to go straight into the chapter. First, I'm going to have a sip of something. Paul stepped through and out. The golden light faded, and he was in emptiness again. By the way, that is because when he reaches a place where he can cross over between worlds, although he doesn't know this yet, there's oftentimes either the river itself is the connecting point between these different virtual worlds, the River of Blue Fire, as it's named in the second volume. But there are also sometimes a golden light that he passes through to get to the next world. He doesn't know this yet, obviously. He's just come through from the first world he'd been in into a new one. Paul stepped through and out. The golden light faded, and he was in emptiness again. The mist stretched away in every direction, as heavy and empty as before, but there was nothing else. There was no finch or mullet either, which was a great relief. But Paul had been hoping that he would find something more on the other side of the glowing gateway. He wasn't quite sure what home meant, but in the back of his mind he had been hoping to find exactly that. Last note here, or not last, but another note, which is that basically Paul has, his memory is extremely compromised. So, which is why he felt that he was really in the First World War. And he is now realizing that he can't trust anything. And, but he doesn't remember exactly how he wound up in this situation. So that's crucial too. He sank to his knees, then lowered himself until he lay stretched on the hard and featureless earth. The mists swirled around him. He closed his eyes, exhausted, without hope or ideas, and for a while gave himself to the dark. The next thing he was aware of was a quiet whispering, a thin, papery sound that grew out of the silence. A warm breeze stroked his hair. Paul opened his eyes, then sat up, full of wonder. A forest had sprung into being around him. For a long time he was content just to sit and stare. It had been so long since he had seen anything but blasted fields of mud that the sight of unbroken trees, of thickly tangled branches still bearing their leaves, soothed his spirit like a drink of water to a thirsty man. What did it matter that most of the leaves were yellow or brown, that many had already fallen to earth and lay ankle deep around him? Just the return of color seemed a gift beyond any price. He stood. His legs were so stiff that they might have been things discarded by someone else that necessity compelled him to use. He took a great breath of air and smelled everything. Damp earth, the scent of drying grass, even the faintest tang of smoke. The sense of the living world coursed through him so powerfully and so richly that it awakened hunger inside him. He suddenly wondered when he had last eaten. Bully beef and biscuit. Those were familiar words, but he could not remember what the things they named were. In any case, it had been long ago and far away. The warm air still surrounded him, but he felt a moment of inner chill. Where had he been? He had a memory of a dark, terrifying place, but what had he been doing there? What he had been doing there, or how he had left, had slipped from his mind. The very lack of things to remember meant that their absence did not worry him long. Sun was filtering down through the leaves, making spots that swam like golden fish as the wind moved the trees. Wherever he had been, he was in a living place now, a place with light and clean air, a carpet of dry leaves, and even, he tilted his head, the distant sound of a bird. If he could not remember his last meal, well, that was all the more reason to find himself another. He would walk. He looked down. His feet were shod in heavy leather shoes, which at least felt familiar and correct, but nothing else in his attire seemed quite right. He wore heavy wool stockings and pants that ended not far below his knee, as well as a thick shirt and waistcoat, also of wool. The fabric seemed strangely rough beneath his fingers. The forest stretched away in all directions, revealing nothing that looked like a road or even a trail. He pondered for a moment, trying to remember which direction he had been traveling when he stopped, but that too was gone, evaporated as completely as the bleak mist, which was now the only thing that he remembered with certainty had existed before the forest. Granted an open choice, he noted the stretching shadows and turned to put the sun at his back. At least he would be sure of seeing his way clearly. He had been hearing the intermittent birdsong for a long time before he finally saw its author. He was kneeling, freeing his stocking from a bramble bush, when something brilliant glided through a column of sunshine just ahead of him, a flash of green both darker and shinier than the moss crawling on the tree trunks and stones. He straightened, looking for it, but it had vanished into the shadows between trees. All that remained was a trill of piping music, just loud enough to claim a single echo for its own. With a stiff tug, he pulled himself out of the bramble bush and hastened in the direction the bird had gone. Since he had no path, he thought he might as well follow something pretty as plod on with no better destination in mind. He had been walking for what seemed hours and had seen no sign of change in the endless forest. The bird never came close enough for him to see it completely clearly, but neither did it disappear from sight. It flitted from tree to tree, always just a few dozen paces ahead. On a few occasions, where the branch it chose for a resting place was in sunlight, he could see its emerald feathers shining, an almost impossible glow, as though it blazed with some inner light. There were hints of other colors, too, a dusky purple like an evening sky, a hint of darker color along the crest. Its song also seemed somehow less than ordinary, although he could remember no other bird's song for comparison. In fact, he could remember very little about any other birds, but he knew that this was one, that its song was both soothing and alluring, and that was enough to know. Brief parenthetical insert here. This, of course, is one of the first, it's not the first because the first iteration of the bird image or the bird theme as something that is actively trying to help him or at least give Paul advice has already come up. There's a kind of a takeoff on the Jack the Giant Killer or Jack and the Beanstalk that happens in the foreword, where Paul meets a woman who is feathered like a bird, and she tries to warn him to get away, that her father is coming or the giant is coming. I can't remember what it is. So this is only the second time, but this thematic idea of a bird leading him on or trying to help him, and the conflation of this bird with a woman, a young woman, who also seems to know him or at least know something about him, is something that comes up again and again and is eventually, of course, tied in and explained much later in the books. Anyway. Afternoon wore on, and the sun passed out from behind the gaps in the treetops, sliding toward the hidden horizon. He had long ago stopped worrying about what direction it shone, so caught up had he become in his pursuit of the green bird. It was only when the forest began to darken that he realized he was lost in a trackless wood with night coming on. He stopped, and the bird alighted on a branch not 3 steps from him. It cocked its head. There was a dark crest, and gave voice to a melodic trill that, though swift and bright, had something in it of a question, and something in it even less definable, but which made him suddenly mournful for his lost memory, for his directionlessness, for his solitude. Then, with a flip of its tail that revealed the midnight purple brushing underneath, the bird spread its wings and spiraled up into the air to disappear among the twilight shadows. A last thread of song floated down to him, sweetly sad, diminishing to nothing. He sat down on a log and put his head in his hands, overcome with the weight of something he could not define. He was still sitting that way when a voice made him jump. "Here? None of that. These are good solid oaks, not weeping willows." The stranger was not dressed much differently than he, all in rough browns and greens, but he wore a broad strip of white cloth tied around one arm like a bandage or a token. His eyes were a strangely feline shade of tawny yellow. He held a bow in one hand and a skin bag in the other. A quiver of arrows stood up behind his shoulder. Since the newcomer had made no hostile moves, he felt it safe to ask him who he was. The stranger laughed at the question. "The wrong thing to be asking here. Who are you, then, if you're so clever?" He opened his mouth, but found he could not remember. I don't know." "Of course not. That's the way of this place. I came in after. I'm not certain, you know. I think it was a deer. And now I won't remember my name until I'm on my way back out again. Queer, this forest." He extended the skin bag. "Are you thirsty?" Interesting small detail there, which through the looking glass, Alice gets through the nameless forest with the help of a deer. One hopes that it is not the same deer that this gentleman, this partisan of the White Queen, which is what the white band around his arm signifies that this partisan of the White Queen is not trying to kill the poor little deer who is kind and helpful to Alice. He extended the skin bag. "Are you thirsty?" The liquid was sour but refreshing. When he handed it back to the stranger, he felt better. The conversation might be confusing, but at least it was a conversation. "Where are you going? Do you know that? I'm lost." "Not surprised. As to where I'm going, it's out. Not a good place to be after dark, these woods. But I seem to remember something just outside the forest that feels like a good destination. Perhaps it will be the kind of place you're looking for." The stranger beckoned. "In any case, come along. We'll see if we can't do you some good." He quickly rose to his feet, afraid that the invitation might be rescinded if he took too long. The stranger was already pushing through a tangle of young trees which had made a hedge around the wreckage of their toppled older relative. They traveled for a while in silence as late afternoon twilight gradually deepened into evening. Fortunately, the stranger held down his pace. He seemed like the sort who could have traveled much faster if he chose, and remained, even in the dying light, a dark shape only a few steps ahead. At first, he thought it was the night air, that the colder sharpness was bringing a different kind of sound to his ear, a different kind of scent to his nostrils. Then he realized that instead it was a different kind of thought that was suddenly drifting through his mind. I was somewhere else." The sound of his own voice was strange after the long time without speaking. "A war, I think. I ran away." His companion grunted. "Yeah, a war?" "Yes, it's coming back to me. Some of it, anyway." "We're getting near the edge of the forest. That's the reason." "So you ran away, did you?" "But not for the normal reasons. At least I don't think so." He fell silent. Something very important was swimming up from the depths of his mind, and he was suddenly frightened he might grab at it too clumsily and lose it to the darkness once more. "I was in a war, and I ran away. I came through a door, or something else, a mirror, an empty place." "Mirrors." The other was moving a little more quickly now. "Dangerous things." And he curled his fists as though memory could be tightened like a muscle. "And my name is Paul." He laughed in relief. "Paul." The stranger looked back over his shoulder. "Funny sort of name. What does it mean?" "Mean? It doesn't mean anything. It's what I'm called." And of course, this is a reiteration or a callback to many of Alice's conversations, both with the Red and White Queen and with Humpty Dumpty, as to what names mean, and the idea of a name as essentially a placeholder for a person versus a name as a description of a person is a big and common thing in the Alice books, and specifically in Through the Looking Glass. But also because of the fact that there are multiple duplicates of many of the people in the Otherland universe, and that every single one of them thinks of themselves as being an individual, despite the fact that many of them are identical copies and others are very similar copies of original versions of themselves. Who somebody is and who they look like are two very different kinds of questions throughout the Otherland books. And we will see that with Finch and Mullet when they make an appearance later on in this section of the book. Mean? It doesn't mean anything. It's what I'm called. It's an odd place you come from, then. The stranger fell silent for a moment, though his legs still carried him forward in long steps that had Paul hurrying to keep up. "I'm Woodling," he said at last. "Sometimes Jack of the Woods or Jack Woodling. That's my name because I do tramp all the woods near and far. Even this one, though I don't like it much. It's a fearful thing for a man to lose his name, although perhaps not so much when the name doesn't mean aught. It's still a fearful thing." Paul was struggling with the new ideas that were suddenly skittering through his head like beetles. Where am I? What place is this? The Nameless Wood, of course. What else would it be called? Just a brief, again, parenthetical comment here. Woodling, Jack of the Woods, Jack Woodling. These obviously are different versions of the same thing. Jack is a very common name of all types in medieval and post-medieval English mythology and folklore. Jack and the Beanstalk, it's Jack the Giant Killer, et cetera, et cetera. But what else is going on too is I was also doing a little bit of a throwback to my own Dragonbone chair, where Simon, if I remember correctly, Simon recites a poem about Jack Mundwode, and Jack Mundwode means Jack Caretaker of the Wood, who is kind of a Robin Hood-like figure. And I mention this now because The Splintered Sun is actually about the historical character in the Ostenard books on whom Jack Mundwode is based, and that is Flan, the outlaw leader of Flan's Crows. Anyway, so we're getting very metafictional here, and I'm getting metafictional with my own metafiction. Just goes to show that it's really better to have a hobby than just to be let loose on writing things. And I need a hobby probably very soon. Anyway, the Nameless Wood, of course. What else would it be called? But where is it? In what country? Jack Woodling laughed. In the King's Land, I suppose. The old King's Land, that is, although I trust you've got the sense not to call it that among strangers. You may tell her ladyship I said so, though, if you meet her. His smile blazed briefly in the shadows. You must be from somewhere far away indeed, that you concern yourself with such schoolmasterish things as the names of places. He paused and pointed. There it is, then, as I hoped it would be. They had stopped on a high place at the edge of a narrow valley. The trees fell away down the gradually sloping hillside. For the first time, Paul could see some distance in front of him. At the bottom of the valley, nestled between the hills, a cluster of lights gleamed. What is it? An inn, and a good place. Jack Woodling clapped him on the shoulder. You'll have no trouble finding your way from here. But aren't you going? Not me. Not tonight. I've things to do, and elsewhere to sleep. But you'll find what you need there, I think. Paul stared at the man's face, trying to make out the expression through the night shadows. Did he mean more than he said? If we are going to split up, then I want to thank you. You probably saved my life. Jack Woodling laughed again. Don't put such a burden on me, good sir. Where I go, I must travel light. Fare you well. He turned and moved back up the hillside. Within moments, Paul could hear nothing but the leaves rustling in the wind. And there is a suggestion, I think, now I'm thinking back 30 years now on some of these things, but there is a suggestion somewhere that Jack Woodling and his fortuitous arrival here to help Paul out of the Nameless Woods may in fact not be a resident of the 8 Squared, which is the name of this looking glass world, but may in fact be the same person who helped Paul to get out of the World War I simulation in the first place. But I can't remember whether that's ever established or not. The sign swaying in the wind over the front door named the inn The King's Dream. It was crude, as though it had been put up hurriedly to replace some earlier insignia. The small figure painted below the name had his chin on his chest and his crown tipped low over his eyes. Those of you who may remember, if I showed the picture, I think I tried to, of the Red King dreaming in exactly that position, with his chin on his chest and his crown tipped low over his eyes. And that idea of we are all part of the Red King's dream, and if he wakes up, we'll all disappear, is obviously part of the idea of the name of this particular inn. Paul stood for a moment just outside the circle of lantern glow puddled in front of the door, feeling the great trackless weight of the forest breathing like a dark beast at his back, then stepped forward into the light. Perhaps a dozen people were ranged about the low-ceilinged room. 3 of them were soldiers in surcoats, as bloody red as the joint that turned on a spit over the fireplace. The young boy tending the spit, so covered with soot that the whites of his eyes were startling, gave Paul a furtive look when he came in, then quickly turned away with an expression that might have been relief. The soldiers looked at Paul too, and one of them inched a little way down the bench they shared, toward the place where their pikes leaned against the whitewashed clay wall. The rest of the denizens, dressed in rough peasant clothes, paid him the attention any stranger would receive, staring as he made his way to the landlord's counter. The woman who waited for him there was old, and her white hair, disarranged by heat and sweat, looked something like the fleece of a sheep kept out on a bad night. But the forearms bared by rolled sleeves looked strong, and her hands were pink, calloused, and capable. Anyway, a couple of quick notes on this here. Obviously, we got the King's Dream part. There's a mention that it sounds as if the sign had been hastily painted, which means that the name of the establishment had recently been changed. And we find several red soldiers, pawns, in other words, inside the restaurant or inside the inn. The fact that Jack earlier had a white band around his arm suggested that this is a territory that now belongs to the red side, but previously belonged to the white side. And the woman behind the bar is fairly obviously also the woman who has owned the bar all along, or at least who has been a person of importance all along. And the white hair, disarranged, that looks something like the fleece of a sheep, is again a callback to Alice Through the Looking Glass, where the White Queen appears for a while as a sheep and then later becomes the White Queen again. So there is a strong suggestion that Jack Woodling is a partisan of the White Queen, and the White Queen, now her establishment essentially under siege by the Red Queen or the Red Pawns or whatever, is still there and still hanging in, but is no longer in power in her own establishment. She leaned on the counter in obvious weariness, but her gaze was shrewd. "We've no beds left." She wore an odd smirk on her face, which Paul could not immediately understand. "These fine soldiers have just taken the last of them." One of the red-smocked men belched. His companions laughed. "I'd like a meal and something to drink." A dim memory of how these things worked wriggled into Paul's thoughts. He suddenly realized he had nothing in his pockets but air, and no purse or wallet. "I have no money, I'm afraid. Perhaps I could do some work for you." The woman leaned forward, inspecting him closely. "Where are you from?" "A long way away, the other side of the nameless forest." She seemed about to ask something else, but one of the soldiers shouted for more beer. Her lips thinned in annoyance, and, Paul thought, something more. "Stay here," she told him, then went to deal with the soldiers. Paul looked around the room. The hearth urchin was staring at him again with an intensity that seemed closer to calculation than curiosity. But Paul was tired and hungry and did not much trust his own overstrained perceptions. "Let's talk about work you might do," the woman said when she returned. "Follow me, back here, where it's less noisy." She led him down a narrow stairway to a cellar room that was clearly her own. The walls were lined with shelves, and they and every other surface were crammed with spools and skeins, jars and boxes and baskets. Except for the small pallet bed in the corner and a 3-legged stool, the room looked more like a shop than a bedroom. Obvious callback again to Looking Glass. The landlady sank onto the stool, fluffing her rough woolen skirt, and kicked off her shoes. "I'm that tired," she said. "I couldn't stay on my feet a moment longer. I hope you don't mind standing. I've only the one stool." Paul shook his head. His attention had been captured by a small, thick-paned window. Through the distorted glass, he could see the water moving and glinting in the moonlight outside. The inn, evidently, backed on a river. "Now then," the old woman's voice was suddenly sharp, "who sent you here? You're not one of us." Paul turned around, startled. The landlady had a knitting needle gripped in her fist, and while she showed no immediate sign of getting up from the stool and coming after him with it, neither did she look particularly friendly. A knitting needle, another sign or another emblem of the White Queen. "Woodling, his name was Jack Woodling. I met him in the forest. Tell me what he looks like." Paul did his best to describe what had been, after all, a rather nondescript man seen largely in twilight and later in darkness. It was only when he remembered the white cloth tied around his savior's arm that the woman relaxed. "You seen him, sure enough. Had he any message for me?" He could not think of anything at first. "Do you know who her ladyship would be?" The woman smiled sadly. "No one but me. He said something about it being the old king's woods, though I shouldn't say that to anyone except her ladyship." She chuckled and tossed the knitting needle into a basket with several dozen others. "That's my Jack, my paladin. And why did he send you to me? Where's this place you're from beyond the nameless woods?" Paladin, of course, is a knight, a particular knight, the knight of a particular noble or noble lady. And of course, this is identifying within this world Jack Woodling as the White Knight, who we said earlier while reading Looking Glass was also probably an incarnation of Lewis Carroll, Reverend Dodgson himself. So, but at least we know that this Jack Woodling is also the White Queen's White Knight. Paul stared at her. There was something more than ordinary weariness in her features. Her face seemed almost like something that had been soft once, but had been frozen into harsh creases by some terrible winter. "I don't know. There's something wrong with me. I was in a war, that's all I remember. I ran away." She nodded her head as if to the sound of an old familiar tune. Jack would have seen that all right. No wonder he took a shine to you." She sighed. "But I told you rightly enough earlier, I've no bed. The blasted Robin Redbreasts have taken the last of them, and with not so much as a copper to pay me for my trouble." Paul frowned. "They can do that?" Her laugh was rueful. "Oh, they can do that and more. This is not my land anymore, but hers. Even here in my pitiful burrow, she sends her strutting fellows to mock me. She will not harm me. What use having one without the only person who can appreciate it? But she will make me as miserable as she can." Who is she? I don't understand anything you're saying." The old woman stood up, puffing out breath as she did so. "You're better off if you don't. And you're also better off not staying in this country long. It isn't very friendly to travelers anymore." She picked her way through the sea of bric-a-brac, leading him back to the door. "I'd put you up here on my own floor, but that would only make those roundheads upstairs wonder why I'd taken an interest in a stranger. You can sleep in the stable. I'll say you're going to do some hauling for me tomorrow, so you won't attract attention. I can at least give you food and drink, for Jack's sake, but you're not to mention to anyone that you met him, and certainly not what he said." "Thank you. You're very kind." She snorted, making her slow way up the stairs. "Falling to a low estate can do that. You see so much more of the world than you did before. You become very aware of how thin the line is, of how little safety exists." She led him back up to the noisy common room, where they were greeted by rude questions from the soldiers and the watchful eyes of the hearth boy. Very briefly, a couple of different themes going on here, which have some meaning both to Looking Glass, the book Through the Looking Glass, and also the Otherland books and how they're set up, which is that from what the White Queen, the innkeeper here, that what the White Queen is saying, it is clear that the game is actually an important part, unlike being simply a kind of a setting, a matrix for the action of Looking Glass, where although it follows the chess game, pretty closely, but the chess game itself is quite silly. Here, there are stakes to these games, and obviously the Red Queen is winning this game and has conquered this territory that used to belong to the White Queen. It also raises the question of at what point is the victory so obvious, like a checkmate, that the game starts over again? Because as we find out later in the other land books, many of these simulations have these kinds of built-in structures to them. And at a certain point, they have to start over again. And certainly the 8 squared, because it's based around this fantastical chess game, at a certain point, the game has to end, and then a new one has to begin. So there is an implication not only that we are in a game that the Red Queen is winning, but that at least there is some hope that there may be another game later on where the Red Queen will be defeated and the White Queen will get her property back. Anyway, continuing on with Paul. A caged bird, a tall tree, a house with many rooms, a loud voice shouting, bellowing, crashing down on him like thunder. Paul came up from the dream like a drowning man, surfacing to the smell of damp hay and the noises of fretful horses. He sat up, trying to shake off the disorientation of sleep. The stable door was partway open, a shadow showing lightless against the slice of starry night. "Who's there?" He fumbled for a weapon, an urging of some sunken memory, but came up with nothing but a handful of straw. "Quiet!" The whisper was as nervous as Paul's stablemate's. "It's only me, Gally." The shadow came closer. Paul could see that it was someone quite small. "The potboy." "What do you want?" "Not to rob you, governor." He sounded aggrieved. "I'd have come in quieter than that were the case. I came to warn you." Paul could see the boy's eyes now, gleaming like mother of pearl. "Warn me?" "Those soldiers, they've been drinking too much and now they're talking of coming for you. I don't know why." "The bastards." Paul climbed to his feet. "Did the lady send you?" "No, locked herself in her room for the night, she has. I heard them talking." He straightened up now as Paul moved toward the door. "Where are you going to go?" I don't know. Back to the forest, I suppose." He cursed quietly. At least he had no possessions to slow his flight. "Come on with me, then. I'll take you to a place. King's men won't follow you there. Not after dark." Paul paused, one hand on the door. There was indeed a soft clatter coming from the front of the inn across the courtyard, a noise very much like drunken men trying to move stealthily. "Why?" he whispered. "Help you? Why not?" The boy grabbed his arm. "None of us much like them redbreasts. We don't like their mistress neither. Follow me." Not waiting for Paul to reply, the boy slipped out the door and moved rapidly but quietly along the wall. Paul pulled the door closed and hurried after him. Gally led him around the back of the stable, then stopped and touched a hand to Paul's arm in warning before leading him down a narrow stone stairway. The only light came from the half moon. Paul nearly stepped off the stairs into the river before Gally took his arm again. By the way, if those of you who don't remember or who haven't read the books, we're going to find out in a little while why Gally's name is Gally and what it's short for. The only light came in from the half moon. Paul nearly stepped off the stairs into the river before Gally took his arm again. "Boat!" the boy whispered, and guided Paul into a gently rocking shadow. When he was seated in the boat's damp bottom, his rescuer carefully lifted up a pole that had been lying on the tiny dock and pushed the little craft out onto the dark river. From above them came the sudden gleam of an unhooded lantern and a clatter as the stable door was flung open. Paul held his breath until the noise of the soldiers' drunken disappointment faded behind them. The trees on the near bank slid silently past. "Won't you get into trouble?" Paul asked. "Won't they blame you when they see you've gone?" "The lady'll speak up for me." The boy leaned forward as if looking for some landmark in what, to Paul, was impenetrable night. "Besides, they was so knocked with drink they didn't know where I'd got to anyway. I can just say I went to sleep in the washing hamper. to get away from their noise. Gally's beginning to sound like a young Dick Van Dyke here. Uh, well, I'm grateful. Where are you taking me? To my place. Well, it's not just mine. We all live there. Paul settled back. Now that his sudden rousing and narrow escape were behind him, he was almost enjoying the quiet of the night, the feeling of gliding along beneath another larger river of sky. There was peace here, and companionship of a sort. And who are we all? He asked at last. Oh, my mates, Gally answered with a hint of pride. The Oyster House boys. We're the White King's men, every one of us. They tied up the boat at a wide pier that jutted far into the river. The place where the pier touched the shore and the narrow stairs leading upward were lit by a single lantern, which swayed gently in the quickening wind. Paul looked up to the shadowy bulk on the headlands. You live there? Do now. It was empty for a while. Agile as a squirrel, Gally scrambled out of the boat and onto the pier. He reached down and pulled up a sack that Paul had not noticed. After he had set it down, he reached back a helping hand. All the boats stopped here once on a time. Men singing, bringing in nets. Paul followed him up the hillside. The stairwell had been cut into solid rock, and the steps were narrow and slippery with night dew. Paul found he could only climb safely by turning sideways, putting the length of his foot along each step. He looked down. The lantern was burning far below. The boat had drifted under the pier. Don't be so slow, Gally whispered. We got to get you inside. Few folk come down around here, but if her soldiers are a-hunting for you, we don't want no one seeing you. Paul leaned in toward the hill, steadying himself against the steps above him, and made his way up as quickly as he could. Despite being burdened with a sack, the boy kept bouncing back down to urge him on. At last they reached the top. There was no lantern here, and Paul could see nothing of the building except a deeper darkness spread wide against the stars. Gally clutched his sleeve and led him forward. After a while, Paul felt boards creaking beneath his feet. Gally stopped and knocked on what was unmistakably a door. A few moments later, an apparition appeared at the height of Paul's knees, a gleaming, sideways, rectangular face. Who's there? The voice was almost a squeak. Gally, I've brought company. Can't let you in without the password. Password? Gally hissed in disgust. There wasn't no password when I left this morning. Open it up. But how do I know it's you? The face, which Paul could now see, was peering through a slot in the door, scowled in a laughable attempt at officiousness. Are you mad? Let us in, Pointer, or I'll reach through and knuckle your pate. You'll recognize that right enough. The slot clapped closed, then a moment later the door opened. A faint, fishy scent wafted out. Gally picked up his sack again and slid through. Paul followed him. Pointer, a small, pale boy, took a few steps backward, staring at the new arrival. Who's he? He's with me. He's going to spend the night here. What's this diddle about a password? That was Miyagi's idea. Some strange folk been coming round today. And how was I supposed to know the password when I wasn't here? Gally reached out and rubbed savagely at Pointer's unkempt hair, then pushed him ahead of them down the dark hallway. They followed the small boy into a wide, high-ceilinged room as large as a church hall. It was lit by only a few candles, so there were no more dark places than light ones. But as far as Paul could see, it was empty, but for the clinging odor of dampness and river mud. All's well, Pointer sang out. It's Gally. He's brought someone with him. Dark shapes emerged from the shadows, first 2 or 3, then many, like the fairy folk appearing from their woodland hiding places. Within moments, some 3 dozen children had crowded around Paul and his guide, staring solemnly, many wiping eyes still puffy from sleep. None were older than Gally. Most were a great deal younger. There were a few girls, but the greatest number were boys, and all of them were dirty and starveling thin. Miyagi! Why, is there a password, and don't you think you might have told me? A small round boy stepped forward. It weren't meant to keep you out, Gally. There were some folk nosing around today we hadn't seen before. I made the little ones keep quiet, and I told 'em not to let anyone in who didn't say custard. Several of the smaller children repeated the word, the excitement of a secret, or possibly a dim memory of the thing itself, clear in the hushed thrill of their voices. Right, said Gally. Well, I'm here now, and this is my friend. He frowned, rubbing the soot on his forehead. What's your name, Governor? Paul told him. Right, my friend Paul, and he's for the White King too, so there's nothing to be afraid of. You lot over there get more wood on the fire. It's cold as a brass monkey in here. Milady sent some cheese and bread. He dropped his sack on the floor. You'll never learn all the names, Miyagi and Pointer you met. Chesapeake's over there, falling back asleep already, the lazy lummox. That's Blue, she's Pointer's sister, and that's my brother Bay. The last named, a skinny, snub-nosed child with curling red hair, pulled a horrible face. Gally aimed a mock kick in his direction. Paul watched the Oyster House boys and girls scatter in various directions as Gally, a natural general, set them each tasks. When they were alone again, Paul turned to his guide and asked quietly, What did you mean I'm for the White King? I don't know anything about this. I'm a stranger here. That's as may be, said Gally, grinning, but since you ran away from the Red Lady's soldiers, I don't think you'll be wearing her token, will you? Paul shook his head. I don't know anything about that. Don't even know how I came to this town, this country. A man found me in the woods and sent me to the inn. A fellow with strange eyes named Jack. But I don't know anything about kings or queens. Jack sent you? And you must have more to say than you're letting on. Did you fight with him in the war? Paul shook his head again, helplessly. I fought in a war, but it wasn't here. I don't remember any more. He slumped down onto the wooden floor and put his back against the wall. The excitement had worn off, and he was exhausted. He had only managed a few hours' sleep before Gally had woken him. Well, never you mind, Governor. We'll sort you out. Gally handed out the bread and cheese, but Paul had eaten earlier, and although he was hungry again, he did not want to reduce the children's small portions any further. They looked so small and poorly nourished that he found it painful to watch them eat. Even so, they were remarkably well-behaved urchins, each waiting his or her turn for a mouthful of crust. Afterward, with the fire blazing and the room warm at last, Paul was ready to go back to sleep, but the children were too excited by the night's events to return to bed. A song! Cried someone, and others took up the cry. Yes, a song! Have the man sing a song! Paul shook his head. I'm afraid I don't remember any. I wish I did. No need to worry, Gally said. Blue, you sing one. She's got the best voice, even though she's not the loudest, he explained. The little girl stood up. Her dark hair hung in tangled knots around her shoulders, confined only by a band of soiled white cloth around her forehead. She frowned and sucked her finger. What song? The one about where we come from. Gally seated himself cross-legged beside Paul, like a desert prince commanding entertainment for a foreign dignitary. Blue nodded thoughtfully, took her finger from her mouth, and began to sing in a high, sweet, and slightly wavering voice. The ocean dark, the ocean wide, and we crossed from the other side. The ocean dark, the ocean deep, between us and the land of sleep. Away, 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 sing oh. They called for us, but we had gone. Away, 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 sing oh. Across the sea we had to go. Huddled with his small tribe, listening to Blue's voice float up like the sparks from the fire, Paul suddenly felt his own loneliness surrounding him like a cloud. Perhaps he could stay in this place. He could be a kind of father, make sure these children did not hunger, did not need to fear the world outside their old house. The night was cold, the night was long, and we had no light but our song. The night was black, the night was deep, between us and the land of sleep. There was a sadness in it that Paul could feel, some note of mourning that sounded beneath the melody. It was as though he listened to the keening of a baby bird which had fallen from its nest, calling across the hopeless distance to the warmth and safety it had forever lost. We crossed the sea, we crossed the night, and now we search the world for light to love us, light to keep the memories of the land of sleep. Away, 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 sing, oh, they called for us, but we had gone. Away, 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 sing, oh, across the sea we had to go. The song went on, and Paul's eyes began to sag closed. He fell asleep to the sound of Blue's small voice chiming against the night. And that's where we're going to stop. And next time I will explain some more things about this section. And then, of course, there's some other stuff coming up almost immediately. So this is going to take me more like 2-3 more nights reading to get through all of this Looking Glass stuff. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed some of those remarks and callbacks and explanations of how Alice's Through the Looking Glass fit into the Other Land. It will become thicker and more complicated and chewy as we go along, but that won't happen until next week because it is now 8:01 and I am finishing up for the night. So thank you as always, and very definitively thank you for spending time with me. I appreciate it very much. I will be back next week, again, barring anything I can't predict now. And we will continue until we get done with these 2 chapters, of which we're about 2/3 of the way through the first one, I think. Maybe 3/4, I can't quite remember. But anyway, doesn't matter. That's enough. Take good care of yourselves. Step number 1. Take good care of your loved ones and your friends and family. And 3, keep an eye out for those who may not be your close friends and neighbors, but may be in need of a kind word, a helping hand, whatever the case may be. It's a tough world out there. And with that, I say peace, and thank you once more for joining me, and I will see you next week, unless I see you online or around the neighborhood. Ciao, babies.